there. Let's get into it. So make away your mobile phones, and I'll stop tapping with the slides here. We're talking about monetary policy during the Great Recession. Hang on, what's going on here? I clicked on the wrong button. That's one of my Minsky software. Okay. Just first of all, though, there's an event which the rethinking students are putting on. If you've got a real interest in economics and how it's done by a non-orthodox approach, which is the sort of stuff that Kingston is promoting, our new associate professor here, Antoine Godin, is an expert in what's called stock flow consistent modelling. So he's giving a talk about that 6 to 8 o'clock on the 2nd, which is about next week sometime, in JG 1007. So Antoine, has anybody had Antoine as a lecturer yet? No? Okay. He's a really good lecturer, really good speaker, very enthusiastic. He knows his stuff extremely well. It's technical stuff, but I think you'll find it quite intriguing about how another way to do macroeconomics apart from the supply and demand and ISLM stuff that you get taught in the mainstream courses, which he'll also teach this in later years. In Year 6, I think you'll find this will be being taught by Antoine. But that's a bit of detail about it. We're going to whack it up on the study space page as well. Okay, well, back to the serious stuff, and to really put the question of what is unorthodox monetary policy into perspective, I've really got to take you through a bit of a quick history of macroeconomics. This is going to be a flying start to macro. It's starting from the point that the crisis itself, when it began, caught the mainstream profession completely unawares. There are only really two mainstream economists you could say who had some inkling of what was going to be happening. One is Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize about 2 years ago, and in my opinion is about the only recipient of the Nobel Prize that actually deserves it in economics. And the second person was Nouriel Roubini, and Nouriel is a bit of a maverick anyway. Nouriel is more of a historian than he is a conventional economic modeller. So basically only those two of them saw it. The rest had no idea happening. What they actually saw is this declining level of rate of inflation, declining unemployment, and they thought, it's going to go on forever. So this is what they were looking at. This is the data for unemployment and inflation in America from 1970 to 2010. Sorry, 2007, just before the crisis began. And you can see the peaks in inflation were rising first of all, so there's a period of accelerating inflation from 1970 through to 1980, and then way down, and then trending down, hitting towards about the 2% level, which is the target. As you're probably aware, this is the target most of the central banks aim for. And unemployment equally increasing up to 1984, and then each time there was a recession, the peak in unemployment was lower. Now, partly that's artificial, because every time statisticians get a chance to redefine unemployment, they redefine it in such a way that less of you are unemployed. Okay, so it's quite transparent in many ways. The American definition, for example, stops counting you as unemployed after you've been unemployed for more than a year. So congratulations, when you've been out of work for more than a year, you're not out of work anymore. Isn't that great? Okay. But nonetheless, even taking those into account, the trend was down. And they basically extrapolated that forward. So Ben Bernanke, writing back in 2004, looking back at the data at that point, said there's been a low inflation era, and that's been also seen significant improvements in growth and productivity and a drop in the volatility of economic data, which they call the Great Moderation. And he said it's a bit, recessions are less frequent, milder, volatility has declined as well. He said there's controversy over where this has come from, but he's willing to take the credit. Okay. But what he says is better control of inflation, which is seen as in conventional economic theory as the responsibility of the central bank to control interest rates and bring inflation down according to their policy. That was what led to it. And then without warning, the crisis happened. And since that period, they've been doing what they now call unconventional monetary policy in general. And you've heard of QE and printing money? Okay. QE is not printing money. Let's make that clear straight away. But that's the shorthand you find in the press about it. So you have to know, to show whether this stuff is unconventional, I need to show you quickly what happened beforehand. So I think if you look at how macroeconomics has behaved since the Great Depression, you can divide it into three main periods. There was a period where what's called Keynesianism dominates, and that's pretty much from World War II till about 1973. That's when I was doing my third year at university, by the way. Keynesian breakdown and the Neoclassical challenge rising mainly at the hands of Milton Friedman, and that was from about 1966 to 1975. So there was a period where things weren't going quite so well, even though Keynesians were swell. The Neoclassical say because Keynesians were in control, things weren't going so well. Then you have this neoclassical ascendancy, and that's from pretty much 1975 right through to 2008. Yeah?
Why is it 2008? Why not slightly before? Just because of the crisis?
Because the crisis, that knocked them off their perches. Absolutely, completely knocked them off their perches. I'm speaking from having a few interesting conversations with some of them as well. So this period of Keynesian policies, the objective was full employment. And to give you an idea of just how strong that objective was, I know the Australian data, of course, and the Australian legal system better than I know the English. You'd probably find a similar paper, I think, by Beveridge. Ever heard of that name? Look for Beveridge. Actually, I think it's the same way you spell alcohol. Yeah? Beveridge. Okay. No, B-I-D-G-E rather than A-G-E, so Beveridge. Look for that name. He would have had, I think he was the person who wrote the English report on the need for full employment after the Second World War. And try to put yourself back in that situation. Imagine that you'd been through the Great Depression when 1 in 4 people were out of a job, and I'm not talking just the youth, I'm talking the whole population. And then you have the Second World War and all the tragedies involved in that, and people being killed on a monumental scale on the warfare. After that, the big pressure was to make life as decent as it could be for the average person, and the comparable report to the Beveridge, well, I think it was the Beveridge report in Australia, was a white paper on employment by Nugget Coombs, as his nickname was. He was a little bloke, so his nickname was Nugget. Nugget Coombs. The policy said, there shall be such pressure on employment as to guarantee a shortage of jobs rather than a shortage of... as to guarantee a shortage of men rather than a shortage of jobs. Okay? Completely different attitude to what you have experienced now, where 0-hour contracts are seen as okay because they give you a job, however badly paid. So full employment was the primary objective, inflation was secondary, and they really achieved both targets until 1966. So if you look at the inflation rate, you can see that was pretty much flatlining below 2%, this is in America, all the way from 1960 to 1966. And unemployment, there are a few peaks, a couple of recessions, but unemployment never exceeded 8%. And that was with a stricter definition of unemployment, much more realistic definition than applies. Pardon me, a bit of a sneeze. It's going to go well on YouTube, isn't it? So a bit less than 8% maximum level, and then flatlining again. Everything looks great, but you notice at the end there's rising inflation starting to strike. And then what happened, and this is what really cruelled the so-called Keynesian period, is that there was both rising inflation and rising unemployment. And Neoclassical said this was due to a combination of deficits, governments running deficits, and monetary growth at the same time. So if you look at the breakdown, this is going from 1960 now through to 1990, you can see this period here where there's both rising inflation and rising unemployment. And the Neoclassical said there was no Keynesian explanation for that. Therefore, that justified a neoclassical interpretation of the economy, and that put the primacy back on keeping inflation under control. And you'll see here, when neoclassical policy began, it began with a period of incredibly high inflation. This is American data. I think the English should be similar. And inflation was running at about 15% per annum. Okay? Put it in context, that's about 20 times what it currently is. Now, at the moment, you don't even consider, you might see prices rising in your own purchases compared to, none of you are buying flat-screen TVs every week, I take it. It's mainly that end of the spectrum that's prices are dropping, but certainly we see less inflation now. So at this period, rising inflation, rising unemployment, along came Milton Friedman with an explanation of why that had happened, according to neoclassical theory. And when the neoclassical became dominant, they pretty much ignored unemployment, or rather said if you get inflation under control, unemployment will take care of itself. Okay? They saw inflation as due to what the government did. So getting the government under control, that would be the end of inflation. And what they expected was falling unemployment would occur just as a corollary of getting the inflation under control. And they were achieved in that sense until 2008. So here's the data now going from 1980 to 2015. And you can see there's a period where the unemployment is falling and the inflation is falling. That's what they called the Great Moderation. And they really thought that was going to go on forever. And then bang, this happens. Great Recession. And they're still in a total pickle and they're trying to explain where they came from. So that's the pattern of data over time. And just to explain why I've got the inverted commas around Keynesian whenever I've used it in previous slides. Who's read the papers by Hicks? Hey, come on, the rest of you. I know I wasn't there last week, but try to read it for tomorrow, okay? Okay, please? Because we'll try to discuss that paper. they're both worth reading. The Hicks paper and the Keynes paper from 1937. If you understand those two papers and then can see the contrast between them, you might actually see them much the same. We'll talk about that tomorrow. We're going to have a bit of a chat about this in the corridor. Pardon? Read it again? You changed your mind? He didn't include expectations. That's the main one. We'll talk about that here. But do read it, and you'll see how, if you read those two papers and then say, how could one be seen as a summary of another, you might get an idea why there's been such conflict in economics here. They're both linked on the study space page, but one is by Hicks, it's called Mr. Keynes and the Classics, and the other is by Keynes from 1937, a couple of months before Hicks wrote his paper, and that's just called The General Theory of Employment. Okay, so those are the two to check out. Now, these policies were based on Hicks and also the American Samuelson, and there was the belief there that you could control the economy by managing demand. So if the company goes into a slump, then you have a deficit which stimulates demand. If it goes into a boom, you have a surplus which reduces demand. And monetary policy you'd use to control inflation separately, but you definitely would use manipulation of the government deficit to try to control the state of the economy. Compare that to what Osborne and Cameron are talking about these days. Okay, it's all about getting the deficit, getting rid of a deficit and having a permanent surplus. And it was supplemented by what's called the Phillips curve trade-off view of economic policy. Have you all heard of Phillips? The Phillips curve? Okay. This is a quote from Phillips's paper. I'm going to put this in context, by the way. Phillips was a dynamic modeller like me. He actually built models very much like the ones that I build. He actually built them using hydraulics, like he made water-based models, and he made an analog computer, like out of valves and resistors and before transistors. He made one of those as well to model the economy. The guy was an engineer. But as part of the models he put together, he argued there would be a relationship between the level of economic activity and the rate of change of wages and markups on goods. And he just drew that in by hand back when he wrote these first papers, and then he went looking for the data in it on one weekend in, I think it was 1956 or 57. And he found this relationship empirically in the data as well. Many years later he said if he knew how it was going to be treated, he would never have done the work. But he did find this relationship, and he did make this statement about it in this paper. He said ignoring years where import prices can cause a wage price spiral, so notice he's talking about cost push pressures causing inflation there, and assuming productivity grows at 2% per annum, which again was a realistic level of the rate of growth of labour productivity over time, if aggregate demand were kept at a value, notice he's saying if we could keep it constant at this value, which would maintain stable product prices, so no inflation, we get no inflation with 2.5% unemployment. If you wanted to have no wage change, which would mean falling prices, he just says there, then stable wages would mean 5.5% unemployment. So he really was saying, what do you want? Do you want, do you want black bean sauce or do you want sweet and sour? Effectively, saying like it's a menu, you can choose the options. And pardon me, not animating this particular part. This was the data. The curve he fitted to data from 1861 to 1913 is the curve on the data there. Notice how close the data from 1951 through to when is it about? So it's 48 to 57. Notice how closely the data fits that curve. And the reaction of both of the economics profession and politicians was fantastic. All the complicated stuff is behind us. All we have to do is choose which combination we want. And when he talked about stable price level, that's that point there. That's where you've got unemployment at 2.5%, and money wages rise by 2%, which means inflation is zero because productivity is rising by 2%. And the other one where he said if you have stable wages, that's right down here, and at that point you're going to have wages not rising, but therefore prices will be falling by 2% because of increasing productivity. Okay? So that was the trade-off of interpretation. But then what happened, that period I showed you from 66 to 73 in particular, inflation was rising while unemployment was constant, which seems, believe me, it is something which only appears to contradict Phillips's argument. But that's what Milton Friedman latched upon. So Friedman wrote a typically neoclassical paper to critique the whole idea of trying to manage demand in the economy. And again, this is the sort of thing which you don't understand unless you read the original paper. Because if you read it in textbooks, it looks quite reasonable. Okay, this is what he actually wrote. He said, imagine a hypothetical simple society. We'll start with a stationary society. In other words, there's no growth. Pretty good way of approximating capitalism. Not. Okay. A constant population, give and take, fixed resources and a fixed state of the art, so no technological change. It'll be simplest to regard the members of this society as being immortal and unchangeable. Simple. Is it realistic? Next, the society, he said, is not static. He said that it has changes. So aggregates change, but individuals are subject to uncertainty. Now, what he means by uncertainty here is that there can be changes in the aggregate levels. They can go up and down. But the mean doesn't. And you've got perfect competition ruling. And he also assumes it's at full employment. So you've actually got the level where there is no, as he defines full employment, there's no pressure to reduce unemployment. And he says money is just pieces of paper, each labelled with a note saying this is $1. They're pieces of paper, okay? No bank accounts. And then what happens is one day, without warning, a helicopter flies over the top of this society. I'm not joking. This is what he wrote. Let us now suppose that one day a helicopter flies over this community and drops an additional 1,000 in bills. The model started with having 1,000 already in circulation. So another 1,000 fall from the sky, which people collect, and everybody's convinced this will never happen again. I'm convinced it never happened in the first place, but this is the model that he's got. So what you got here? He's got a helicopter, flies over the top of the world, buzzes around a bit, drops dollar bills everywhere, and people go about and pick them up. Okay? Only an economics journal would publish nonsense like this. It's actually published in a book of readings, but nonetheless. So what you have is a brief increase in economic activity. It's already at full employment. People go and grab the extra dollar notes, try to spend them to spend more dollars than they actually want to keep in their pockets. It's because one person's spending is somebody else's income. They can't spend them down. So all they do is drive prices up. So for a while there might be more activity and people think there's more demand out there. But as prices start to rise, the economy returns to equilibrium. So you're starting an equilibrium, you have a disturbance caused by too much money being created, and you end up back in equilibrium. That was his model. So he said the final equilibrium has to be a nominal income of $20,000 because he had the money turning over 10 times a year. So $1,000 produced $10,000 worth of GDP. Now it's got $2,000 producing $20,000 of GDP. All you've got is inflation. And then he said, you have a continuous stream of helicopters dropping money over the. What's a reasonable? If you wanted to make an analogy for this, what is a reasonable analogy of a helicopter dropping money over the country? Pardon? Printing money, yeah, and really printing money in this case, actually producing dollar notes or pound notes and, throwing them out of helicopters. The Queen goes by and waves and pound bills fall out of her elbow rather than just the wave. So that's the belief. He said if you do that at the rate of 10% per annum, then people will try to keep the amount of money they hold constant. Notice they're not putting it in the bank here, they're keeping it in their pockets. Okay? And therefore all the real levels, like in terms of the amount of output per year, the employment rate, etc., all those things don't change, but prices just move up at the same rate, 10% per annum. So the fact that you anticipate this, initially you get surprised by it, then you get used to it. But what you do at that point on, every year you just continue increasing your prices, whether that's if you're selling goods and services, you increase your prices by 10% per annum. If you're a worker, you demand a 10% wage rise every year, and you just get inflation locked in. So inflation becomes driven by expectations of inflation. And here, this is one of the great travesties in the history of economic thought. Neoclassicals argued this is the point at which neoclassical economists introduced expectations into economic theory. Now, if you read Keynes in that 1937 paper, you'll find Keynes was talking almost exclusively about expectations, but not formed in this manner. So what this argues is, if you start with a Phillips curve relationship, but the Phillips curve moves out over time because of this flow of new money turning up all the time, because the government's trying to drive unemployment below the equilibrium level. That's the interpretation. The economy is already in equilibrium. The government's trying to reduce unemployment below the equilibrium level and doing it by flying helicopters over the country. That's the vision. So what you get is this idea that the level of expectations moves out. So you start from an initial natural rate where your supply of labour equals demand for labour, and then you have an increase in the money supply, you're trying to hit a target rate down here. So the government's target rate is below the equilibrium level. So you have a bit of inflation. You go up the Phillips curve like that. That's a short-run Phillips curve. And you get to this point and people get used to the inflation and their expectations adapt to expect inflation all the time. So the economy returns to equilibrium and goes back out here again. And then if you have you whack more helicopters in the sky, or the Queen waves twice as hard, up goes another short-run Phillips curve. People adapt again, and up you go. You get up the whole range of short-run Phillips curves like this, and ultimately you've got a vertical one, the long-run Phillips curve. That was the interpretation he made. Okay. In terms of the A to B logic, does that make sense? Okay, so that's the logical argument he had behind it. And so what it proposes is that you need accelerating inflation to sustain the target of below equilibrium unemployment. And therefore that shouldn't be allowed because that's you get a short-run gain out of it, but long run you get the pain of inflation, which he argued was really destructive. This is Maggie Thatcher's basis for bringing in the tight control of the money supply she did back in the 1980s, I think it was, and also Volcker in America as Federal Reserve chief. But that's not good enough for neoclassicals, believe it or not, because it still implies that the government can have a real impact on the economy. If the government's willing to tolerate accelerating inflation, then they can permanently reduce the unemployment rate below the equilibrium level. And one thing which, the argument being, if you increase the money supply, you get a lower level of unemployment, a high level of output, then as people's expectations adapt, the unemployment rate falls back to the equilibrium level. So you just increase the rate of growth of the money supply again, and you get a lower level of unemployment. Just keep on doing it. The inflation is going to accelerate, but you're going to have a lower level of unemployment than the market would give you. Okay, which implies the government can do something to stimulate the economy, whereas the neoclassical position always is that the government really can't do anything beneficial. Okay? The government can make things worse, but it can't make things better. That's really the neoclassical perspective. So the only way to get rid of this and say that the government can't do anything except cause inflation is to say that rather than expectations adapting in response to experience, they adapt immediately because people predict the future. Okay? Now we're getting off with the fairies here. And this is Robert Lucas, one of many Nobel Prize winners who I think point out that the Nobel Prize ain't particularly noble. He argued that it's natural for an economist to see the correlation between output and prices, so changes in output and prices moving in the same direction, as arriving from a volatile demand schedule, so imagine your demand line moving up and down a lot, and a fairly stable supply curve. Okay, just think about the micro level stuff there. You have a demand curve, fix your supply curve, move the demand curve up and down, and you'll get movements in real output and movements in prices at the same time. That's the basic logic there. But he said that poses a dilemma because the absence of money illusion. You know what I mean by money illusion? If you do your micro theory, have you done indifference curves yet? Okay. You know the idea, you draw a budget line, you draw indifference curves, and then you say, what happens if you double all incomes and double prices? What happens? The answer is nothing. Okay? So that's money illusion, is believing you double all prices and double incomes, something does happen. Now, I'll argue in a later course that money illusion makes more sense than... The money illusion is a nonsense concept when you're in a monetary economy, because if I double all prices and double all incomes, I halve the real value of debt. Okay? If you have any debt in existence and you double all prices and double incomes, you make your debt servicing cost half what it was beforehand. And there's no simple way to adjust the rate of interest to cancel that effect out as well. So money illusion itself is an illusion. Okay? The value of money does matter. And neoclassicals are wrong to rule it out. But they start by saying there's no role for money prices in affecting real demand. So they say rational people don't have money illusion. So rational people know if prices double and incomes double, nothing changes. That implies a vertical supply curve, which is effectively the vertical Phillips curve that Milton Friedman has. And that means that aggregate demand fluctuations should only affect prices. So now draw a vertical supply curve in your head. and move a demand curve up and down, you don't change the quantity, all you do is change the price. And that's the argument he had here, and say that how can we resolve this paradox? And he said, well, we can have a refined view of the decision problem-facing agents in which short-run behaviour under available information differs from long-run behaviour under perfect information. So in the long run, we know the future perfectly. Okay? We have perfect information. So this is adaptive expectations. This is the argument that Friedman has. In the short run, you get deluded by the helicopters changing the amount of money and you think there's more real demand in the economy. But in the long run, you adapt and you realise that it's only a temporary effect, so you fall back to the equilibrium again. He said that's not good enough, because that still applies that you can have the government varying the level of the output in the economy. And notice what he says here, the standard hypothesis of adaptive expectations, which is what Milton Friedman put forward in that paper, leads to an inadequate formulation of the natural rate hypothesis, which is that there's a natural rate of unemployment. Okay? That's the argument. There's some fixed rate the economy will return to. Rational expectations does lead to the natural rate hypothesis. So he prefers rational expectations here, not because it fits the data better, but because it's the only way to get rid of any argument that monetary policy can have real effects. That's why he prefers it. So it's choosing it in a sense for an ideological reason. So the essence of the rational expectations, which is what starts to dominate macroeconomic policy over time, is that people have a model that lets them predict the future. And again, this is why I talk about Keynes's paper so much about what he says about expectations. He says we simply can't know the future. So we therefore form very fragile expectations of the future, largely based on extrapolating what's happening now. Whereas the Neoclassicals say we can actually predict the future accurately. So if you have adaptive expectations, then tolerating that inflation will drive up real output for a while. Okay? But that only happens if actual inflation differs from the inflation you expect. So you see, this gives you systematically biased expectations of inflation, and they permit a short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but a long-run vertical relationship with a natural rate of unemployment. And the only way to get rid of that is to replace adaptive expectations, which is delayed learning of the present, with rational expectations, which is anticipation of the future, accurate anticipation of the future. So this particular phrase, again, you won't find this in the textbooks, which again is why I want you to read originals. And as I said, I think last week, even if you find lots of mathematics are in the originals, read around the math. If you can't read the math, read around it. You'll still find the explanation there. And this is his argument here. It says the hypothesis of adaptive expectations was rejected as a component of the hypothesis that there's a natural rate of unemployment the economy will always return to, on the grounds that under some policy there's a gap between actual and expected inflation. Okay? That's what E brackets PT minus P star means. He says, if the impossibility of a non-zero value is taken as an essential feature of the argument there's a natural rate. In other words, he's saying we assume there can be no difference between the actual rate of inflation and the rate people expect. So your predictions about inflation have to be always accurate. Now, how does he justify that? Well, he says we can add that as an additional axiom. In other words, we can simply assume that actual inflation always equals expected inflation. Okay. What do you reckon about that? I can assume I can jump to the moon. It's the same sort of thing. It's a bizarre expectation, but he says, or assume expectations are rational in the sense of mirth. So in a sense what he's saying here is that rational expectations are the same as presuming people can accurately predict the future. That's how they handle expectations. Now you won't find them admitting that, but that's fundamentally what that logical argument means. So that became an essential element of this. This is now an explanation that really says the economy is always in full employment. So how do you explain the variations we actually see? Because you're saying the economy is always in equilibrium, and relative prices are set by technology and taste, consumer on one side, firm on the other. If you have any inflation, that's only due to what the government does by producing too much money, because the government completely controls the money supply. There's no endogenous money And the banks themselves, if they produce money through a money multiplier process, they're completely controlled by the amount of base money the government creates and the money multiplier. So what turns up, is the explanation is that we can predict that any increase will cause inflation, so you get an instant adjustment to the rate of inflation by any money creation. Prices instantly adjust, no change in real output. That's the sort of argument. So this is partly a quote, a semi-quote from Lucas again. Optimising agents pass money shocks they can predict directly onto prices, so there's no change in real output. But that then means you've now got another dilemma. How do you explain the fluctuations you actually see? Okay? Because you do see the movements in prices and real output that he talked about earlier. And this is where what's called real business cycle theory comes in. Have you heard of that one at all? Okay. This isn't taught. It's like the foundation of the modern approach to macroeconomics, which they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE. Have you heard of that one? You probably caught that in third year. Devrim Yilmaz is our expert on that stuff. It's really an extension of neoclassical growth theory. And there you've got to go back in time to 1925 when a bizarre polymath called Ramsey, died at the age of about 25, I think, published this paper when he was saying, what's the optimal rate at which society should save? Like the hypothetical question, imagine there's a central planner who decides how much we should save for the future. What amount should we save? That was the question he set himself. And to do that, he abstracted from virtually everything you might consider as involved in macroeconomics. So he started off by saying simplifying assumptions. Always watch out when somebody says simplifying assumptions. Ask yourself, are they simplifying assumptions or are they fantasies? So he said, you can independently add and calculate the pleasure and the pain that's involved in earning a living, consuming, etc., etc. So you can add them up. You ignore distribution of income. You assume the economy is always going to have the same attitudes towards accumulation of wealth. So there's no chance of one generation consuming, chance of our savings being selfishly consumed by subsequent generations. So there's no intergenerational conflict either. And there's no crises. Nothing's ever going to go wrong. No misfortunes will wipe away previous accumulations. Like, for example, the Great Depression that began 5 years after he published this paper. That won't happen. So you're assuming away all these elements of reality. And you had output being a simple function of the amount of capital and labour, the normal neoclassical production function you get. An equilibrium would occur where the ratio of capital to labour was constant. So this is your production equilibrium is where your ratio of capital to labour settles down, but you're going to approach that point over time. Okay? You're starting off from a non-perfect point. You're getting towards this perfect point there. And he describes society's preferences by a single utility function. So all the stuff you've done about utility for a single agent, a single human being, consumer, you imagine you can use exactly the same idea for the whole of society. So, that means you don't need to worry about the distribution of income between yourself and Rupert Murdoch, for example, or the Queen. So he says, this is actually from a textbook. Now suppose that there is a social planner whose goal is to maximise the discounted utility from per capita consumption. So this is the other side of it. You want to get the maximum utility you can out of the consumption per head. So they're presuming, effectively, that even though we're talking about capitalism, it has a central planner. Okay? So what you get, when you put all the mathematics together, you get a system which has got two equations in it, two dominant equations. It's this third equation that turns up in most DSGE models as the foundation. They get much more complicated than that. But when you describe the mathematics of this function, it looks like a saddle. Okay? Now, if you reckon I gave you the challenge of taking a marble and tossing it onto a saddle and making it stay on the saddle, who reckons they could do it? No takers? Because it's unstable, isn't it? The marble lands anywhere except on here, and if it's doing anything except running directly up and down the ridge, it's going to fall off. So mathematicians describe that as an unstable system. And the only way you can actually get there is by starting on that point in the first place. If you dropped a marble really carefully on the middle of the saddle, it might not slide off. Okay? And if you're really clever, you might be able to put it up here and let it oscillate. That'd be really, That'd win you a couple of prizes on some TV game show if you could do that. So that's where you have to drop the marble, and then it goes up and down. Now, mathematicians call that an unstable system, because there's zero odds you'll do it, and you all can see why there's zero odds you'll actually achieve it. But they say, no, that's not unstable. Rather, it is unstable, but we are rational. And since we are rational, we can work out how to do it. So they say that we can reach the unstable equilibrium. And in Ramsey's case, when he was writing his paper back in the 1920s, he was saying, well, a social planner knows what to do. So a social planner can work out what the equilibrium point is in the far future and work out the unstable path to get there. Okay. Now, to reach this future point, he actually called it a bliss point, a point of bliss in the future. And to actually get there, what you've got to do is change your investment and your consumption. Because you divide output into either consumption or investment, if you're going to have to, for example, increase investment to get there, then you have to reduce consumption. Equally, if you want to reduce investment to get to that point, you've got to increase consumption. So it's not just a case of changing some future target, it's also changing what we do today. Now, what happens if you get new, and I've got that in inverted commas, information about the future. Do you think there's such a thing? Information about the future? No such thing, okay? I literally got that as a phrase from an editor of one of the leading journals rejecting one of my papers because I didn't assume it was possible. He said, what if they get more information about the future? How will that change things? Okay? So this is how delusional this discipline can be. Well, if you do get more information about the future, because now you're back in Ramsey's model, you're presuming you have an all-knowing central planner who can work out the future and knows the present and knows people's tastes and accurately describes them, etc., etc. That future planner can work out the optimal position. But if there's a change in technology or tastes, then the optimal position in the future changes, and so does the path to get to it, which means you have to adjust today's consumption. So, for example, if there's more leisure should be consumed now, then there'll be less output, which means from a sane point of view, there'll be a slump in the economy. Okay? People are consuming less, there's less work happening, less output being produced, there's a slump. Or you might decide you need to have less leisure now, you've got to work harder, there'll be more output, there'll be a boom. So what you have here is the argument that the change in output we see at any point in time is an optimal reaction to a change in knowledge. And that's exactly what these real business cycle models did. They said that the business cycle is the optimal reaction of society to change future circumstances. And the trade cycle mechanism is like this. Let's say you start on an unstable equilibrium growth path. So there's time, there's your per capita consumption, and here you are at the moment. That's where you're currently consuming. And there's your future point of bliss. That's what you've worked out in the future, given the taste and given the technology, that's where you want to get to. So there's your current unstable path to get there. So if you start from this particular point of consumption, that's where you begin. Then you get new information about the future, and that changes where that future bliss point is. Let's say it whacks it down below the other one. That's your new point of bliss you want to reach. And there's your new unstable saddle path. So what you have to do is instantly change your consumption from here to one time period further on. You've got to jump up to there. So you've gone from one optimal position to another optimal position, but there's been an increase in consumption coming out of that, and therefore people are working harder now. Okay? So even a downturn like the Great Depression is an optimal reaction to change circumstances, and nobody is involuntarily unemployed. People who are not working have chosen not to work because there's the disutility from working is not compensated by the utility from the consumption they can do. Okay. Anybody feel like you've had a weird weekend yet? Okay. This is the sort of thinking they go through. And it's actually used to explain everything, including the Great Depression. This is the guy who was the original developer of this model approach, one of two people, Edward Prescott. And when he said the Great Depression is a great decline in market hours, which he means is the amount of collective number of hours of labour worked by people. So it's a voluntary, what he sees the Great Depression as is a 25% fall in the level of work being done as a voluntary decision by workers to work less. And what caused it? He said, I think this great decline was the unintended consequence of labour market and industrial policies designed to improve the economy. So it's government, some sort of government policy occurred that made it less desirable to work now, so people work less in the 1930s. Sound convincing to you? All you've got to do is look at one photograph of the Great Depression, but they just don't look at history. So exactly what these changes are is not clear. So even though this is his hypothesis, he had no explanation of what this change might have been. And that's in a paper called Some Observations in the Great Depression, written back in 1999. So I'm not talking ancient history. And I'm talking a guy who got the Nobel Prize for developing this approach to modelling. And their explanation in general, this is the two of them, actually another one, Cahoe's different, Cahoe and Prescott, said they say that government policies which change labour productivity are the main determinants of Great Depressions. So the government causes Great Depressions. And they see capitalism as always being stable and always in equilibrium as well. And again, in disturbances, the government's fault. This again is Prescott here. In this rather intriguing finish to this paper, he said the Marxian view is that capitalism is inherently unstable and excessive accumulation of capital will lead to crises. So growth theory, which is the stuff I explained a moment ago, which he said is empirically successful, that is completely baloney. Empirically it's been completely contradicted, but nonetheless he believes it's been predicted properly. He said capitalism is stable and absent some changes in technology or government policy, the economy converges to a stable growth path with standard of living doubling every 40 years. And there's some important change of the rules in the 1930s which changed the level of work people wanted to do, and that was what caused the Great Depression. So the Keynesians had it wrong. Employment wasn't low because investment was low. Employment and investment were low because there's some change in labour market policies that lowered normal employment. Now, that's I can only describe that as delusional, but even some neoclassicals also basically agreed with me, would agree with me. They just said this is off with the fairies stuff. And have you heard of what's called the distinction between freshwater and saltwater economists? Have you heard that one? Take a look at, search up saltwater versus freshwater. And these are seen as being freshwater economists, the reason being the people who developed this stuff come from universities in the inland of America, on the big rivers, Chicago, Minnesota, etc., etc. Whereas the people who said this is just too extreme tend to come from the coastal universities. So you have Columbia, Massachusetts, Harvard, etc., etc. That are all on the east coast, some of them on the west coast. And they just rejected it and developed what they call new Keynesian models as a reaction to that. So that said the economy would reach equilibrium if there were no shocks. When a shock does occur, the return to equilibrium is not instant, it's not optimal, it's slowed down by what they call frictions. And frictions are things like imperfect competition, so you have monopolies, or trade unions, and they say that they just simply exist, we know they exist, that means prices are sticky. So prices don't adjust instantly. And in the delay until prices adjust, then you can have involuntary unemployment. That's become the dominant modelling approach. So this is quoting a paper actually from an Australian economist, but he's fairly well known in this field. He said his model allowed for short-run nominal wage rigidity, so wages wouldn't adjust completely, and therefore and that depends on the labour market institutions. It'll differ from one country to another. So that taken with an explicit role for money, which again is novel in a mainstream model, gives the model its noted the inverted commas, macroeconomic characteristics. So ultimately this model will return to steady growth equilibrium, but unemployment will emerge for long periods of time because of wage stickiness. So that's pretty much the state of mainstream economics before the financial crisis came. And I can see there's people who need a cup of coffee here after that talk, so let's take a 10-minute break and come back and keep on rolling. Okay, hang on. Wrong one. So to boil down what was happening with economic policy before the crisis came along, the main tool that existed in these new Keynesian models that dominated policy setting was the interest rate, what they call the policy rate, the rate that the Federal Reserve charges other banks. And what they assumed was that investment would react to the policy rate. So changing the interest rate, you'd change the level of investment. And the central bank, what it was doing was summarise what was called the Taylor rule. So this is named about a guy called Taylor, obviously. And what he said was the rate of interest should be equal to this thing here. The rate of interest should be equal to the rate of inflation plus the gap between actual output and what they see as potential output divided by 2 plus the inflation rate minus 2 divided by 2 plus 2. Now it looks a bit complicated, okay? But it's actually quite a simple equation. And what it says is by varying the interest rate you will therefore vary the inflation rate. And pretty much it's saying you change an inflation rate, change the interest rate twice as much, and you'll slow down inflation. That's what he thought summarised what banks had done. And he put it in a graph. This is the sort of idea. They've got a target. Hang on, I've got that. Where's my animation? Going the wrong way around. Okay, you had the heavy red line there is full employment. So they've got the economy fully employed, and all that's varying is the inflation rate and the interest rate. And they're saying what they're trying to reach. This is answering your question earlier about where they're trying to get to. They believe that the economy is absolutely perfect situation when the inflation rate is 2% and the Fed rate is 4%. That's their target.
Banks are just going to borrow less, aren't they?
Yeah. But the banks are going to lend far less. That's really the story. Yeah. People are going to be willing to borrow far less from the banks. That's what they've left out.
But also banks lending to each other. If the rate's at 4%, no bank's going to want to pay back that much, are they?
Yeah. Well, they're not going to. They don't actually. Reserves aren't all that important, though. No, they're not. I'll show you why in a sec. Let's get to that point. But that seemed to all be working until 2007, and then the crisis hit. And this is just to show you how much they had no idea it was coming. This is the OECD, and they built one of the biggest, what they call new Keynesian models of the economy. And they feed every country's data into a little model for that particular country. And this is their prediction. The current economic situation is better than we've experienced in years. Our central forecast remains quite benign. A soft landing in the United States, strong and sustained recovery in Europe. Compare that to what actually happened. And they said sustained growth in the OECD would be underpinned by strong job creation and falling unemployment. That's what they told politicians in June of 2007.
What are the OECD economies, sir?
Pardon?
What are the OECD economies? Are they just...
The OECD economy is all the major wealthy countries. So like Japan and Korea are inside there, but not China, for example. It's all of Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Japan, and I think that's it, and Korea. But only the top 20 global economies in terms of actual level of income. And the crisis actually began about 2 months after that statement was made. There was a shutdown of a fund by BNP, and the housing market, where prices were already falling in America, but they began to accelerate in 2007. And the Federal Reserve was still relaxed about the economy in December of 2007. So 4 months after the crisis began, they're still saying, it's all going to work out fine. The beautiful thing is these days you can actually get the documentation of what the policymakers were saying and thinking at the time they said it. So this is a transcript of the Federal Reserve's governing body, the FOMC, stands for Federal Open Market Committee or Open Market Operations Committee. FOMC. This is the body that makes the decisions about interest rates. And here's the report from the chief economist. He said, overall, our forecast is still painting a pretty benign picture. Despite the financial turmoil, the economy avoids recession. Okay. Inflation falls a bit. He said, so I tried not to take it personally when I received the notice the other day that the board had approved more frequent drug testing of certain members of senior staff, myself included. This is comedy at the central bank. Okay. And he then said that I can assure you that we're not going to use arguably using mind-altering chemicals. We came up with this projection unimpaired and nothing stronger than late-night diet pizzas and vending machine Twinkies.
Why do you think most people are so naive to
So don't you think they know it? They just don't want to tell them.
No. They actually have a model in there. See, economy is such a complicated creature. You really can't look at an economy like you can look at a car. Like a mechanic can look in a car, they can work out what all the cables and settings do, they can tune it, etc., etc. You're actually working with a physical thing you've got control over. When you're working with an economy, you start from a model. You start from some mental framework that you understand, and then the model you build actually dominates how you think about the economy. So what they're saying is, if we feed these current conditions into our model, then nothing bad happens. Now, if your model's accurate and you feed these conditions in the model, all hell breaks loose, okay? Because that's what actually happened. But if you have a model that's not an accurate model of the economy, but it's still the model you believe, then you don't see this stuff coming. This guy, yeah. One of the great ironies of how universities and central banks and all that stuff operate is that anybody who goes through and wants to become an economist really aspires to becoming an academic economist, most of them. Okay? And that's like Ben Bernanke was a professor of economics before he became head of the Federal Reserve. Janet Yellen, I think, was a professor as well. But the top hierarchy, in other words, is the academic economists who aspire to getting a Nobel Prize. So they're the ones who set that's the Roger Federer or the Djokovic of who's a decent soccer player. I don't know the soccer players. Ronaldo. That's the Ronaldo target. They always work in the academic circles and they get Nobel Prizes. Some of the top people in central banks also end up there, but most of them are not quite as sharp as the leading academics. So what tends to happen, the central banks and the treasuries have people who don't quite make the grade to go to the top American universities, which still happens in America. What they do is they take the models that are developed by the top academic economists and implement them. So, like the model that Lucas built first off had 3 equations in it. I think actually 2 equations. I'll have to take a look. I think it was 2 or 3. Very simple model. Well, the Federal Reserve takes that model, takes it as being the best possible way of modelling the economy, and then produces a 100 and 200 equation version. So they do very sophisticated work. What they're doing is applying the models that the mainstream economists teach to them. And in universities, what will happen is characters like me will get a job at a university because of whoever was doing hiring at the time was not totally mainstream, or quite a few people will start off believing the mainstream stuff and then go through some sort of epiphany and reject it. And they go from being like a neoclassical to a Marxist or a neoclassical to an Austrian. But they've got tenure, you can't get rid of them. But if you actually work for a central bank and you go through the same epiphany, they kick you out of the central bank and you get a job in social security, effectively. So in that sense, the treasuries and the central banks were more conservative than the university departments. But what's happening now, intriguingly, is that the central banks and the treasuries are the people who get criticised by the politicians when things don't work out the way they said the models were going to say it works out. So consequently, there's more pressure on central banks and treasuries to be realistic now. And it hasn't had much impact in most of the world, except the Bank of England, I have to say. I gave a seminar at the Bank of England yesterday at their invitation. Okay? So the bank is very open to non-orthodox thinking. The central bank the England Central Bank is probably the most progressive and the most broad-minded in the OECD. So they're open-minded, but the Federal Reserve has become, in some ways, even more reactionary. So they've sort of bunkered down. It's a strange dynamic. It really is a very strange dynamic. Did that cover them? Okay. So even after it, there's still no significance of how important it is. Olivier Blanchard was the chief economist for the IMF. He also was the founding editor of this journal called the American Economic Review, Macroeconomics. Now, I was stunned when I saw this paper come out, because this is literally a year after the crisis began. And I see this thing turn up by Blanchard on one of the main working paper archives, and I simply can't believe it. So after this, he's now talking about the debate between the fresh water and the salt water, okay, the real business cycle, DSGE people. And he said after that explosion, there's an enormous progress. For a while, it feels like a battlefield, so the fresh water and the salt water were fighting each other in economic departments and in conferences. They ignored each other's bitter fights and controversies. But after a while, a largely shared vision has come out. Not everything is fine. Some things have lost. The state of macro is good. Okay? This is a year after the theory failed to predict the financial crisis. Then unemployment just goes through the roof. So if you look at the data, and get back to this again, the long data from 70 to 2010, that's what they had no idea was going to happen. Let's just go back up, pardon me. You have this increase in unemployment and inflation turns to deflation very rapidly. Totally took them by surprise. They're still not adjusting to it, still not expecting it completely. What really woke them up was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Have you heard of Lehman Brothers?
Yeah.
Okay. That happened in September 2008, and the reason it had such a huge impact was that Lehman Brothers had cornered what's called the commercial paper market. Now, in the past, you know what an overdraft is? Okay. A lot of small businesses operate on overdrafts. Okay. A lot of large companies use what they used to call lines of credit. And that's where you'd negotiate, like, say, a company like General Motors might negotiate a $100 million or $1 billion line of credit, which is like your credit card. You can access up to $100 million. You start with zero. Any amount part of that you access, you have to pay interest on, but it's sitting there giving you headroom to vary how much money you borrow depending on wage rises and raw materials costs and stuff like that. Banks made that too expensive. So what actually happened over time was companies like General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and so on in America would issue what they call commercial paper. So they'd produce a General Motors bond, let's say the face value of the bond was $100. You could buy that $100 bond for $99, and in 90 days' time they'd buy it back from you for $100. So they're paying like 1% interest over 3 months. Okay. Lehman didn't do that, but there had to be a market to trade these things, and Lehman pretty much cornered the market. So when Lehman collapsed, instantly many US companies weren't going to be able to pay their wages. It could happen in days. Okay, so the level of panic that happened when this occurred was absolutely enormous, because really people thought if we don't sort this out, and I'm talking in days, capitalism ends. That's the vision they had. And when you talk to people involved in this, I've spoken to one of the guys involved, a guy called Edward Lazar, who was Bush's chief economic advisor when this crisis happened. And he just said, look, the state in Bush's advice was sheer absolute fear, complete panic. And the guy put it best in a book is this guy, Paulson, who was actually used to be head of one of the major, I think it's Goldman Sachs. But he said, we need hundreds of billions of assets. I knew better than to utter the word trillion. That would have caused cardiac arrest. This is writing in his book. He said, we need an announcement to calm the markets and legislation next week. And he said, what would happen? People asked, what would happen if I don't get it? He said, may God help us all. That's the state of mind they were in. And so forget about theory. They were now throwing everything they could into the American economy to try to turn it around. They still saw this rise in unemployment and the fall in inflation. That's looking at the data from 2007 to 2010. So the economy, as far as they were concerned, their model of the economy didn't predict it. The economy had broken down. They had no idea why. But there's still a complacent response by the theoretical economists. This is Blanchard again, and saying, after looking back and seeing, well, state macro wasn't so good, he then says, well, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Most of the consensus still holds. So the ultimate targets are still output and inflation. The natural rate is still true, a good enough approximation, so the economy returns to an equilibrium level. Policymakers shouldn't believe there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, the same stuff I showed you earlier. Okay. Stable inflation is still the major goal, and fiscal sustainability, in other words, reducing government budget deficits, is of the essence, all that sort of stuff. But the crisis continued getting worse. In Europe, of course, it was absolutely appalling. It still is appalling. So the fiscal consolidation was, when you look at it, deepened the crisis. And Blanchard, to his credit, did the empirical work to say it made things worse. So you find them talking, this is an article from Blanchard now, I think in 2013, saying what we did, we looked at the forecast error between what we said would happen if we reduced government deficits and what actually happened. He said, if you have the conventional theory, which is rational expectations and people using a correct model of the real world to predict the future, if you do all that, then the coefficient should be zero. In other words, you get it right and things will happen exactly as you think they will. So you predict a budget tightening, you predict that'll make the economy better, and your prediction will be accurate. You said, but if they underestimate fiscal multipliers, this is again how they try to understand what happens with the economy, but they say there's some multiplier relationship between changing what the government does and changing what happens in the real economy. And what they were saying effectively is that the multiplier should be 0, I think it was, or maybe actually 1, or 1 for 1 change. Government goes down, private sector goes up. Overall, no change. That's the sort of thing argued. In fact, they said it was wrong. Growth disappointments were greater in economies that had greater fiscal cutback. So the bigger the cutback by the government, the bigger the downturn. So rather than saying a downturn would be neutral or even stimulatory, which is what some of them argued, they found that cutting government deficits made things worse. Okay. Now, Cameron still hasn't read that by the looks of things. Pardon? Pardon? Yes, effectively. Yes. When they first started talking about austerity, they actually dreamt up this phrase what they called expansionary fiscal consolidation. And that was the argument was if government cut its budget, that would mean people would know they'd be paying less taxes in the future, and they'd also be made more optimistic by the government cutting back its spending, so they'd invest more and spend more. And therefore a government cutback would actually stimulate the economy. That's one of the arguments that got published. Yeah, I agree. But that's what they believe. So what you really had was, far from a recovery, you had a second Great Depression. This is looking at the inflation and unemployment figures in Spain now. And you can see they went into deflation for a while again, then a bit of inflation, now back to deflation again. Unemployment rose from about 9% to 26%. Now that's a Great Depression level of unemployment. So a seriously failing policy. And at this stage, they then went into what you can call unconventional monetary policy. So I'm really starting the title of the lecture now with these slides here. This is what Bernanke did. I think it's one of the most amazing graphs in economics, in the sense of just showing how the radical change in policy. There's a gradual increase in the amount of base money. Now, base money is reserves plus notes. This is the bank reserves. You add up all the reserves the banks have, private banks have, and you add up all the notes and coins in circulation. That's base money. And notice that it was basically a nice gradual increase to what the hell happens here? It doubles in 1 year. Actually doubled in 4 months. That's how hard Bernanke hit the accelerator. And he's now trying to sell his book. His title of the book is called The Courage to Act. And he clearly acted. But my little retort about him in one of the interviews recently was say, I wish he had the courage to think. Because it's the model that he had that led him astray to not believe this was going to happen. So his theory, why did he do that? Well, this is his theory, his particular model. If you go back, he got the job as being Federal Reserve Chairman because he'd seen by neoclassical economists as the expert on the Great Depression. But my argument about Bernanke is he's not an expert on the Great Depression. He's an expert on explanations of the Great Depression that are consistent with neoclassical theory. Now, the only way it can be consistent with neoclassical theory is say the economy can't have a crisis, it's got to be the government's fault. Okay. So who did he blame? He blamed the Federal Reserve. Looking, in one of his papers, he's saying, looking at the monetary data, it underscores the stinging critique of the Fed's policies by Milton Friedman and his collaborator Anna Schwartz. He said that the United States was the only country where policy was destabilising. The ratio of monetary-based reserves fell. Nominal money growth was precisely 0 between 28 and 29. And the cause of the decline in M1, now M1, you know what M1 is? That's pretty much... It's type of money. It's the money, pretty much money in bank accounts, private bank accounts. It's mainly restricted to what they call demand deposits. So it's money you can go to the bank and pull it out straight away. It used just to be cheque accounts. Now it tends to be cheque accounts and also some savings accounts. But he was back in these days, you didn't get paid money on savings accounts. So most of the money he was talking about back in the 1930s was cheque account money, okay, which is M1. He said there's a decline in M1. He said the cause of this decline was contraction of the ratio of base to reserves. So rather than having a big money multiplier, it was getting smaller, and he blamed the Federal Reserve for that. So he said that ratio, the contraction in base to reserves, reinforced rather than offset declines in the multiplier. So the tightening, this policy, locates most of the blame for the early slowdown on the Federal Reserve. So it's the Federal Reserve's fault. Into 1930. What happens in 2007? He is the Federal Reserve Chairman, or 2008. So he reacts dramatically to that amount of money. having said again that it was actually the Reserve's fault. And I love this one. I mean, the stuff you can find on the web is just gorgeous these days. Here's him speaking at a party for Milton Friedman's 90th birthday. And he finished up by saying, "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as a representative of the Federal Reserve. I'd like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again." Well, didn't that blow up in his face? So what he was trying to do is to increase the money supply using the money multiplier. And that is an argument. You all heard of the money multiplier? You think it sounds like a sensible explanation? Pardon? You're dead on. You're spot on. That's the case. It sounds convincing until you look at it deeply. So I'm going to take you through a fair bit of detail here. So the basic idea is the government creates some fiat money, whether by deficit spending, they pay people a dole check, that sort of thing. So somebody gets $1,000 for £1,000. They put that in a bank. The bank hangs on to the reserve requirement, which is, say, 10%, which means they keep $100 and lend $900 to a borrower, and the borrower then deposits that money in another bank, and the bank then does the same thing, hangs on to 90, lends at 810, and you keep on going, and ultimately you create $10,000 out of 1,000. That's the conventional model. Now, there's several propositions in there. First of all, the government's in control of the money supply. It creates the initial injection and sets the reserve requirement, and the government comes first, and credit money follows along, and it's mechanically controlled. That's the sort of argument. And if you look at it, I won't go through this table in detail given the amount of time we've got, but that's the basic idea. Have a deposit. Whoops, hang on, let's go back up again. Come on. You have what's going on here? My damn mouse. Okay, deposit of 1,000. Bank keeps 100. So there's £100 in cash. It then has 900 here, but it makes a loan of 900. That's that 1,000, 10% of that, 90% of that 1,000. Then that means there's $900 worth of loans plus 90, so you've got 190 in cash in the bank. And as you keep on going, over time the deposits converge to 10,000, where 1,000 of that is cash and 9,000 as loans. That's the basic mechanics. Again, I'll take you through that in more detail in the tube if you like, but that's the basic proposition. So that implied this huge increase in the money supply, in base money, would cause a dramatic increase in the money supply. And in fact, poor old Obama, I have a lot of time for Obama in general, I must say, compared to most American politicians. That's not particularly difficult. But he was giving the speech to justify these policies. He actually used the money multiplier. Now, he's a lawyer. He's not a trained economist. So he would have been swallowing what was fed to him by his economic advisors, who include Bernanke. Okay? So people, a lot of Americans will think the government would be better going directly to them instead of banks. Where's our bailout? Our classic Obama speak. And it says the truth is that $1 of capital in a bank can actually result in $8 or $10 of loans. Notice that? Of loans to families and businesses. A multiplier effect that can lead to a fast rate of economic growth. So he was sold on this stuff by his economic advisors. So the money went to the banks, not to the public. But it didn't have the results they expected, because what happened, rather than lending out these reserves, they simply accumulated excess reserves. And it's quite dramatic when you take a look at it. Lending to the private sector is supposed to rise, it actually fell. So here's the reserves the banks have above what the policy requirement is, and that's another dramatic graph. Basically, because they don't make any money out of excess reserves, for the whole of recorded history of the data of the 1960s, it's zero. And there's a tiny little blip here. That's the only little upward step there. Then, bang, gigantic increase in excess reserves the bank they don't need to fulfill the policy. It exceeds what they actually have to hold. Looks very much like the graph you saw before. So most of the money Bernanke pumped into the banks didn't go anywhere. It stayed in the banks. Private lending, on the other hand, reached a peak and then went sideways, and actually went down for most of the time that Bernanke was doing this policy. The level of lending fell. It's only been rising in recent couple of years. So, but at the same time, this is also vital to see, while they were doing all this as policy and believing that's the only one that should work, simply because of the scale of government spending, there was a gigantic fiscal stimulus to the economy. So this is showing the surplus, American surplus, and notice it's normally zero. plunges during the First World War because, of course, they're paying to finance the First World War. Then you have, during the 20s, running about a 1% surplus. The Great Depression strikes, they run about a 5% deficit. Try to go back to surplus again, that fails. Then the Second World War starts and nobody complains, nobody said we can't afford to build that bomb. You know, we've got to drop less bomb on Hitler because it's going to cost too much to build the bomb. Nobody ever said that. So consequently, 25% of GDP was the level of the deficit. Then back to surplus for a short while. And then this trend over time to about a 3% or 4% deficit on average. Then from 1990 on, a trend towards a surplus. That's the Gulf War pretty much. Then the crisis strikes and bang, the level of spending during this crisis was more than twice the level during the Great Depression. Not because the government decided to do twice as much, but because the government was about 4 times the size. It was much. The government back in the 1930s was much, much smaller than the government is today. So that's what's happening in the background. That was a major reason why the economy recovered. But they also dropped their rate to zero, the interest rate. So here's you're talking about earlier about trying to go back to 4% again. That was because of the Taylor rule target, the 2% inflation, 4% real rate. But notice they've been at zero since 2009, and they rapidly fell. They were rising the rate all the way through to the crisis, flatlined for a while just above their target, their real desired rate, and then plunged in the aftermath of the recession. It's been zero ever since, or 0.25, that sort of thing. So what they then did was borrow a policy from Japan, which is called quantitative easing, and that's what we mainly mean when we say unconventional economic policy. That's the main idea. And what happens here is normally central banks are buying and selling bonds from and to the banks all the time, and also parts of the public. And so if the government sells a bond to the private sector, like for example I bought government bonds back in 1996 because I believed the interest rates would fall, so I thought I wasn't going to speculate on a house. I should have speculated on a house, would have made far more money. But I bought government bonds at that stage because I expected rates to fall and therefore the value of the bond to rise. So by buying that bond off me, or selling the bond to me, that takes money out of the economy. Okay? So that's open market operations are happening all the time. And equally, when they buy government bonds from the private sector, then that's putting money back into circulation. So that's been happening all the time. But they're normally buying just government bonds. Now with QE, they'd buy private sector bonds as well, and that's things like mortgage-backed securities and so on, which I'm sure banks have overpriced. So the banks have done very nicely out of this as a profit-making venture with the central banks. And that was intended to drive commercial rates down very directly over the whole spectrum, to make borrowing more attractive and to make interest costs lower for firms that invest. And it was deliberately done to drive up asset prices, which they thought would encourage spending, by people feeling wealthier and spending more, even though the Federal Reserve has done empirical research and said there's no wealth effect from shares. They do think there's a wealth effect from housing, but no wealth effect from shares. So in America, the scale of it, just to give you an idea, it was $85 billion per month, or roughly $1 trillion a year. So we're not talking peanuts here. That's a huge amount of money. And that's the scale they're willing to do to try to turn this economy around. And luckily, last week I happened to be in the audience for Draghi making this speech, which I'm going to be quoting extensively from now to give you a central banker's version of what's actually happening. America's finally wound that policy back. I think they're still doing some QE, but not the same scale. Europe was slow to embrace it until they really got seriously in the crisis, but now it's the only stimulatory measure they're doing in the whole of the euro. This is him talking in Frankfurt last week. So there are many reasons why these asset purchases, they call it the Asset Purchases Program, APP. So many reasons why that should have an impact on activity and inflation. So first of all, it compresses yields. So it reduces the gap between the rates that the banks charge and the rate that banks earn. Okay, so they've got a smaller gap there. And so that's going to reduce the cost of financing in general for the economy. It makes lending for the real economy more attractive than purchasing bonds for the banks themselves. Higher financial and real estate asset prices can increase demand via wealth effects and lower cost of equity. And they say, looking at what's happening, it actually drove yields down by 1.5% over about 9 months. They see it having a dramatic impact upon the economy. But they say that's 1.5% they couldn't do using the reserve rate because the reserve rate was zero. So it's an alternative to try to drive commercial rates down when they can't drive their own rate down. He said there's also spillover effects, so cost of market finance falls across the economy. Bank bond yields fell by 0.75%. Investment grade bonds fell by 1%, etc., etc. And so that for these things to boost activity and inflation, then this has to be passed on to the real economy. So how does he reckon that happens? So he said we might think that banks, because they're trying to reduce their own debt levels, maybe banks would retain the money, the stimulus, rather than doing more loans. Okay? Notice what he's trying to encourage here is more loans to the private sector. He said, in fact, that the power of the transmission mechanism has been rising. He's now doing a sell job here. So he's saying between when they began it in June of 2014, lending for non-financial companies has fallen by 0.7%, and by 1.1 or 1.2 on the periphery. So it's cheaper to borrow money. And he said that is equivalent to this. If they could cut the base rate, because they can't right now because it's zero. He said if they could, that's the same as cutting the base rate by 1%. And there's a very fast response there. So he's saying QE's been effectively like dropping rates by 1% if they were able to do that. And there's now increased demand for credit, which he sees as a positive thing, rising levels of private debt again. So that gives a better macro position. He said even non-performing loans have fallen. Now this to me, that's a danger sign to me. Because if this has actually led to a fall in non-performing loans, they're going to start non-performing again at some point. So he's not worried about lower margins hurting banks. He says at one point that policies that are good for the economy are good for the banks. He said even though it's putting pressure on their margins, that's compensated by volume effects. So yes, we've taken some profit away by compressing the margin, but you're making more loans. Okay? So it's all predicated on being successful in making more loans to the private sector. So there's more activity overall, and non-performing loans are going down, which also makes them more profit. And that is an effect. If you actually reduce non-performing loans, then you allocate more of the revenue you get from interest to profit and distribute it to shareholders. But of course that means you're more volatile if there's a turnaround in those non-performing loans. Means, well, if you lend money from me and you just say, look, sorry Steve, I can't repay you next week. I said, that's okay, well I'll just add that money you haven't paid me back to the principal, and I'll compound that as well. That's a non-performing loan. Keep it on for long enough, I declare you bankrupt. Okay? So he rejects criticisms of QE as well, and I think this is why I just thought, you can imagine my facial. I was in the front row. I don't think he was looking at me, but I had pretty revolting facial expressions as I heard this stuff being spouted. But he said, it shows our policy is not just effective, it's also showing that concerns about the program only causing asset price inflation and only benefiting the wealthy were wrong. So he's sort of misguided. He says, it's true that it's driven up share prices and house prices. But what matters is the mirror effect of this, a lower cost of capital, and so a boost in spending power because firms are borrowing more money. If that's got a broader impact, and notice this, it's a broader impact on output inflation, which eventually boosts employment and incomes and reduces income inequality. Sorry, that's a flying pig so far as I'm concerned. The increase in wealth has been dramatic. The change in income is still going downwards. Per capita incomes are still falling in most of Europe. So it's nonsense to say that it's boosted incomes. It's just political policy making. But he's saying at the same time that it hasn't been the world's best recovery. The underlying recovery is modest, and the upswings in 2013 is the weakest since 1998. He said that's, again, because conventional economists expect with a big downturn you have a big recovery. Because if you go a long way from equilibrium, you rapidly get back there with a turnaround. So he's saying that hasn't happened this time round, and in fact that's amazing because the economy is also benefiting from lower prices for energy. Because I guess across the same period of time, oil's fallen from about $120 a barrel to $40 a barrel, and Europe is predominant by far an oil importer, not an oil exporter. So that should have boosted activity as well. He said none of the previous rebounds since 1998 have had cheaper oil prices. In fact, normally it's been rising oil prices and they've recovered despite those prices. And he said also we've never had monetary policy as helpful as it is now. Finally, the recovery is very protracted, and there's a wonderful chart. I'll insert this into the lecture before I put it up on Study Space. But he said it took between 5 and 8 quarters to recover from previous recessions in the 70s, 80s and 90s. During the recent recession, which is the worst since the 1930s, it took the Americans 14 quarters, so the Americans took twice as long as Europe did in previous crises. They said this time it's going to take 31 quarters, about 8 years. Okay. And that's if their predictions are right. Believe me, I don't expect them to be right. But he says despite the fact that it hasn't been all that crash hot, he's going to keep on doing current policy. And to me, the political implications of this were amazing, because he's basically saying, I'm going to do what I want to do, I'm going to follow the model that I believe, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop him, because he's not answerable to any parliament. The whole way that their central bank independence is framed, they don't have to answer to the European Parliament or any of the national parliaments. In fact, they're not allowed to be challenged effectively by the parliament. So there's no mechanism to hand control back from the central bank to the politicians, but actually exists in America. They're saying we can adjust this program all the way through, and this is an incredibly emphatic ending. If we decide that the current policy is not working as we'd like it to, we will do what it takes to raise inflation as much as possible. At the same time, of course, inflation is not recovering. They're still looking at zero inflation. Okay? So it's being an ineffective policy, despite the vigour with what they're putting it forward. So conventional policy is just reduce the policy rate and increase the base money. That's the standard argument. Unconventional policy is buying private sector bonds to try to reduce private sector interest rates when you can no longer vary the policy rate and stimulate demand for credit that way, and increase asset prices by this wealth effect. But there are two fallacies even with conventional policy, and this comes back to the Hicks paper I want you to take a look at before tomorrow's seminar. That sees interest rates as the main determinant of how much investment is going to occur, which is the Hicks interpretation of Keynes. And Keynes actually argued that expectations of future profit are far more important. So it's very hard to stimulate demand by dropping the interest rate when people have got depressed expectations about future profit. And this is all based on a model of money creation which is false, as you pointed out earlier, so I'll take you through why it's false. Because what the money multiplier model implies is that banks need reserves to be able to lend. And the idea is depositors put money in a bank records a deposit as a liability for itself. So because if you put money in the bank is required to return it to you if you come along and ask. You put your card into an ATM, you don't expect the bank to say, I'm sorry, you're not getting the money back. Okay? They might tell you they're out of cash at the moment or the machine's broken, but you can expect to pull that money out. So it's a liability for the bank. They also put it effectively in their vault, so it's an asset for the bank at the same time. So it increases their liabilities and their assets by exactly the same amount. So accountants do this by using double entry bookkeeping. Anybody doing accounting? Done it before? The uni or where? The college. Okay, you've got the whole, this idea of the fundamental law of accounting? Yeah, well, yeah. Assets minus liability equals equity, or you can say it the same way, assets equals liability plus equity. And the way that accounting, this is an identity, it's just the way they define the system, so it's not a roughly equal, it's precisely equal. And the convention that I'm using here in my modelling, and I think it's more straightforward for economists to follow than the credit and debit stuff you would have learned for your accounting, is to show assets is a positive amount and liabilities and equity is negative, and therefore every row sums to zero. So the assets plus liabilities and equity equals zero in every row. Okay, so let's look at that and see what happens with a double with a deposit going in. Here we have initial level of 100 reserves and 900 of loans. So the deposits are also 900, in fact the bank equity being 100, and then somebody deposits $10 or whatever. So that puts up reserves to 110, deposits to 110, nothing else changes. Now, according to the bank, the money multiplier model, the bank now has got $10 of excess reserves, so it can lend, and that should create $100 worth of loans. Okay. So it can hold on to $1 and lend $9. The very first stage in this process is the bank's going to hang on to $1 of that and lend out $9. But how? Because if I now put this in terms of accounting, and I show the bank lending out $9, I've got to say it's dropping its reserves by $9, which is minus 9. Here, I've got 10 from this person. I'm hanging on to 1. Here's 9 for you as a loan. But that means the reserves fall by minus 9. the borrower is supposed to receive -9. That's like showing the minus there means the bank owes a liability to you. So you've got $9 as a positive sum in your cash account. Yeah? Okay? Yeah. So what you get here is you don't get 0. You get -18. That violates the fundamental law of accounting. You simply cannot lend from reserves. There's ways in which you can do, there's an arbitrage story I can tell in a more complicated vision, but the simple vision here, you can't do it. You simply can't lend from reserves. So the whole idea that you can do it is an accounting fallacy. And like so much in economics, it's a delusional model. It doesn't apply in the real world. So what you actually get is what the Bank of England, bless their cotton socks, have come out and said in a great paper last year, that the reality of how money is created differs from the description in textbooks. And said rather than banks receiving deposits when households save in the lending amount, bank lending creates deposits. And the central bank doesn't fix the amount of money in circulation, nor is central bank money multiplied up. So I can now quote the Bank of England on this, which makes... I've normally got to quote rebel economists to make this argument, or accountants and so on. Now I can quote the Bank of England. It makes my life a lot easier. So reserves are irrelevant. What reserves are there for is for banks to make transactions between themselves, just like you do between each other. So if you, for example, if you deposit your money at a private bank and then you transfer money to somebody else, your account goes down, the other person's account goes up. So with lending, what reserves do has got nothing to do with lending. What it does, what controls lending or has some effect on lending is how highly geared the bank is. What's the ratio between the bank's equity and the loans it has? So what reserves are used for is to transfer money from one bank account to another because of what one individual does. So imagine you're banking with RBS and you go into a shop which banks with Lloyd's. Then whatever you take out of your RBS account to pay Lloyd's, the bank, let's say you're shopping at Curry's, okay? You're buying a computer at Curry's. Well, the money that you take out of your account to pay Curry's has to come out of RBS's reserve account and go into Curry's account, which is stored at a Lloyd's bank. So this is what it looks like. And that's my program Minsky again. I know that's too hard to read, so here's a second look. What you have, if somebody does a purchase up here, so you have a transfer of money from your account to here, this is the central bank. Somebody purchases here, that means the reserves of RBS fall. Those reserves are transferred to Lloyd's, and that then means the money can be transferred into Curry's bank account. So reserves are like cash for banks, but they're not money that circulates in our economy. So that basic idea is wrong itself. And QE is equally wrong because that's increasing the reserves of private banks. It's not going to help them lend. It doesn't trigger the money multiplier because it doesn't exist. Okay? So in a sense, QE is relying upon the same sort of mechanisms that the conventional theory has. But if you have QE with banks alone, then that's going to give banks reserves that they aren't earning any money out of. So I don't know this for a fact, but I've got a feeling banks use that money to go and buy shares. Now if they buy shares, the people they buy the shares off bank in banks, so the aggregate level of reserves doesn't change. But it's going to encourage banks to be buyers of shares, to get assets that earn an income rather than reserves that don't earn an income. It doesn't increase the money supply. If, however, they buy from pension funds, if you have you guys aren't old enough to have pension funds yet, I suppose. Do you have pension funds or not yet? Okay, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. But with pension funds bank at private banks. So if QE involves buying stuff off pension funds, that does increase the money supply. But of course, pension funds by law have to spend that money predominantly buying assets. So they're going to be doing the buying. It's also driving up asset prices. And the only effect that comes into the real economy is going to be a trickle-down effect because the people in the pension funds paying themselves a fortune will now be able to hire more domestic servants, and the company might buy more equipment and buy more marble for their entrance and so on. What would put money directly into the economy is what's been called people's QE, and Corbyn's been talking about this recently. And that would be putting money directly into private bank accounts, and that would increase the money supply directly. But it's not what the central banks are doing. So I just wanted to put a quick model of this all together. Again, this is monstrously hard to read. But what I've shown there is the basic mechanism. So I think I actually stuck with it in my second last slide. But if you look at what can happen with QE, the money supply are the liabilities of the banking sector that circulate in the real economy. So that's all these ones here. And what I show is conventional buying off banks has no impact at all. Buying off pension funds has an impact, but it puts money in pension funds who might then buy stuff off share traders, but they won't buy goods and services. If you gave it to people directly and required them to pay their debt off, then you would increase the amount of money and reduce the amount of debt. So that would work. But that's not what they're doing. They're starting to talk about it, but it's more politicians saying it now than central bankers. And of course, QE to work, as you saw from Draghi, has to involve an increase in the level of private debt. So they're saying, he says, if a bank's it makes lending more attractive, so they're going to lend to the real economy. We're going to increase pressure on the banks to lend more money. And then maybe we're driving down their margins, but they're getting more volume. So everything about increasing the level of debts to the private sector. And that's going to support the recovery of the economy. And Obama again, notice when he said here, $1 of capital can result in $8 or $10 of loans. So it's still seeing this stuff creating additional debt in the economy. And they don't think there's any problem about, therefore, increasing the level of debt. And finishing with this slide, the old Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. Well, the globe's got them a problem because this is the level of private debt to GDP. And they're behaving as if it wouldn't matter if that level got higher. Now you can see it's gone from 60% of GDP in America back in 1955 to 165% at the crisis. Then it fell dramatically. Europe pretty much tracked the same level and is now stabilising at about 170% of GDP as a debt level, and they think they can drive it higher. They've got Buckley's. So unconventional monetary policy has the same flaws as conventional policy. It ignores the level of private debt, and yet it's trying to cause a recovery by driving up debt levels when they're already at astronomical levels. So it ain't going to happen. So that's pretty much QE. Any questions, or in shock mode still? Let's talk about it tomorrow. I will make tomorrow's tutorial, I promise. Nobody's going to steal my